Welcome to the premiere of Connect. In the next half hour, we're going to connect you to great ideas and inspired thinking.
We give up this picture of Jefferson as a marble statue, as a perfect man, as the founding father with the capital F's, that we gain something more.
Joining us is historian Virginia Scharf, author of The Women Jefferson Loved. Dr. Scharf paints an intriguing portrait of Thomas Jefferson and weighs in on the controversial question of whether Jefferson fathered children through his slaves.
Once we know what makes these good proteins go bad, then we're well on our way for a cure.
Professor Eva Chi's research on protein dynamics is at the forefront of Alzheimer's research. She seeks an answer to the life and death question of what makes proteins in the brain go bad.
When I think about the robot, I really don't think about that, robotic unit with moving awkwardly,
And our viewer question gives us a fascinating look into the future as we visit the lab of Professor Yasemin Mostofi, who recently won a prestigious Presidential Science Award. The question, how do we get robots to think for themselves? Connect is next. Dr. Virginia Scharf, Distinguished Professor of History at the University of New Mexico, joining us this morning, and also the author of several books. One of them, which we're going to be talking about right now, The Women Jefferson Loved. Let me ask you, why is Jefferson still relevant today?
Well, as the author of the Declaration of Independence, I think that's kind of our national scripture. Right? The idea that all men are created equal. This is, we just celebrated Martin Luther King Day. This is King expanding on the vision of Jefferson. The wonderful historian Gary Wills has argued that Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is an expansion of the vision of Jefferson. So for all of us, it's really about who's entitled to the privileges and immunities of citizenship. We're still fighting about that. The immigration fight is about that. All of kinds of women's rights, or the rights of persons of color, all of these things are still at issue. And everybody wants to go back to Jefferson and find kind of, in Jefferson's writing, in Jefferson's world, the nugget of their dignity and their virtue and their citizenship and their humanity. And at the same time, we are very concerned about hypocrisy. And so we see this slaveholder and this guy who reigned as a patriarch in his own world, reigning as a king and railing against a king at the same time. Yeah. And we say, this is our national conundrum. One historian has said, if Jefferson was wrong, then America is wrong. And I think we're still grappling with that. So from my point of view, I believe pretty strongly in the idea that women ought to have the opportunity to do anything they want in the world. For me, the conundrum was, how could a man who'd written these stirring words that created the possibility for the Declaration at Seneca Falls that all men and women were created equal, how could he be such a complicated and hypocritical kind of guy? And I think I wrote the book to try to answer that question in my own mind, and came out feeling a little more sympathetic toward him than I expected to.
Yes. How did the women in Jefferson's life help shape his vision for the country?
Well, I think that Jefferson was a man who believed in something he would have called a self-evident truth, something that was so obvious to him that it didn't even bear explaining. And this was an idea that comes down to us, and we still believe it, and that's the idea that in a perfect world, a man should be free to live a happy life and take care of the people that he loved, the people who depended on him. And so from his point of view, all of society should be engineered so that a man could be free to live a happy life and take care of the people who depended on him. And most important on those lists were the women in his family, his mother, his wife, his daughters, the Hemings women, the people who were both dependent on him but upon whom he depended to keep his domestic paradise in order. This was a man who definitely lived in a man's world, but he also lived surrounded by women. 6 sisters, only 1 brother. When his father died when he was 14, his mother raised him until the age of 21, where he then took over the affairs of the plantation. But definitely a man who lived in a house full of women.
Right. And speaking of the women, the title of this book, why this title, The Women Jefferson Loved? I mean, that's a pretty sexy title. Is it, we're talking more about the women that he had liaisons with?
People will say to me, oh, the women Jefferson loved. Well, how many were there, right? Right. How many at one time? I mean, it does work that way, and of course one wants one's book to fly off the shelves now. But at the same time, I wanted this title to do the kind of work each word had to do some work. So I wanted the women to come first because I wanted to know about their lives. But I also explored what love meant to Thomas Jefferson and what love means more generally. And when he talked about love, he wasn't talking about a relationship among equals. We have this fantasy that when a man and a woman love each other, that they ought to be accepting each other as partners and equals, and that have the same options open to each other. That's a product of really the last 30 years of history. But he believed in a world where men and women had reciprocal obligations. They were not equal at all. He wasn't talking about women.
They had their
in the
roles.
Declaration. Absolutely. And men were made to protect and provide for the people who depended on them, and women, including women, and women were made to please and to nurture and to obey. And in a world where they were fulfilling their natural duties, men and women would do this.
Right, and that was Jefferson's view of how it should be.
Absolutely his domestic paradise.
So did Thomas Jefferson father children with Sally Hemings? Did he have slave children with one of the slaves on his plantation? I guess that's what everybody wants to know.
Everybody wants to know that, and I think it's interesting why everybody wants to know that. Why do we care whether this happened?
Same reason we read the National Enquirer, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I think it's partly that, but I think it's also a matter of wondering about, what is it that makes the Founding Father tick? We used to have this vision of American history where it was all kind of great white men who seemed as if they lived in absolutely in isolation. There was nobody around them. They thought their great thoughts. They occasionally battled with one another, but there was nobody around them. And I think the question about whether a man like Thomas Jefferson, who writes the Declaration of Independence, has an affair with his slave, more importantly, has a kind of long-term relationship in which children are involved, and does he care about this? I mean, this takes him out of the context of a marble statue in a godly pantheon, or the bust that is in the Library of Congress or whatever, the portrait in the National Portrait Gallery, and it puts him into a real world inhabited by real people. The answer to your question is that I think the best evidence suggests, and most historians believe who've thought about this matter in a fair-minded way, that Thomas Jefferson is most likely to have been the father of the Hemings children. There is DNA evidence that a Jefferson male fathered at least one of her children, her youngest son, Eston Hemings, who by many accounts was said to look an awful lot like Thomas Jefferson. Sally Hemings was his wife's half-sister. He was very, very grief-stricken when his wife died. Only after 10 years of marriage, she died because of repeated difficulties with childbearing. He was 42 years old at that time, and somebody who really believed in the notion, I think, of sentiment and of romantic love, and did love his wife by everything I have been able to figure out. I think they had a passionate marriage, and I think that he promised her on his deathbed that he would never marry again, but of course her mother had died bearing her, and she was raised by Sally Hemings' mother, who had...
Interesting crossover.
And Sally Hemings' mother, Betty Hemings, had 6 children with Martha Jefferson's father.
Wow.
So she brought these enslaved half-brothers and sisters into Jefferson's household. She instructs him on her deathbed never to marry again, surrounded by her own 2 surviving daughters. There was a baby who would die shortly thereafter. Yeah. And the Hemings women in this room, including little 10-year-old Sally Hemings at this time. Wow. And so for her to say, I think in some ways it's saying to him, not a marriage. I don't want stepmothers for my daughters. Right. What else you do, you're going to have to figure out.
Right.
And by many accounts, Sally Hemings was a beautiful woman. She is somebody who had 1 African grandparent and 3 English grandparents. Right, so if you think about it that way, this is somebody whose racial identity is very, very mixed, but it's fixed because she grew up in Virginia at that time. She's born to a slave mother, and she's born in Virginia, ergo she's black and enslaved. But it's much more complicated than that.
Why do we care so much about Jefferson's private life? I mean, it is interesting to us. We have a fascination with what things were really like beyond what we know from what our history books teach us.
Well, Augusta, I was almost going to say, well, lately, we want to care about private lives of politicians, but in fact, people have cared about Thomas Jefferson's sex life ever since he had one.
Wow.
So, the scandal begins to emerge when he is probably, I think, really around the 1790s when he's first really getting into politics
So he's
in the country.
even during his lifetime.
Yeah, and it really bursts forth when he's president of the United States, and it's published by this guy James Callender, and the Federalists are trying to make hay about it, and it emerges again and again over American history. And I think in many ways it's about the question of are we really a nation of black and white people, or are we a nation of people? Are the races really separate? And I think, people can't quite square the idea that people would care about each other regardless of race if they're trying to maintain those racial boundaries.
Sure. And Thomas Jefferson really embodied, he was called a Renaissance man. He really was sort of a unique individual of his day, and yet he had a soft heart for the women who surrounded him.
I think he had a soft heart. I think he expected them to please and obey and nurture him. But at the same time, he really cared about them. He wanted his daughters to be learned. He said that he wouldn't have thought much about educating his daughter Patsy, except he calculated her chances of marrying a blockhead at 16 to 1. So he wanted to make sure that she'd do okay with the household accounts and so forth. And he loved them.
Yeah.
He wrote extremely affectionate letters to them. He used the word love a lot. So this was somebody for whom these relationships were not just matters of duty, but also matters of deep emotion.
Even being a slaveholder, there were some truths that he still held dear and true to his own heart.
I think he made promises that he would protect and provide for them, and that Patsy would have Monticello and be able to live out her days, and that nobody would, deprive her of her security. But the problem was that he could not control his finances. He liked to spend money. He was a little bit of a shopaholic. He was a planter at a time when being a planter was an economically absolutely unsustainable thing to do in Virginia. So he dies $100,000 in debt.
Wow.
He had promised her Monticello, he had promised her security, he had promised he'd protect her, and he leaves her destitute, broke, and depressed, and homeless, really. So he couldn't keep his promises to her.
Much as he wanted to.
It broke his heart, absolutely broke his heart. On the other hand, he promised Sally Hemings that their children would go free. And all of her children went free. So ironically, the person to whom he kept most of his promises was Sally Hemings.
How do you feel about Jefferson after writing this book?
I admired Jefferson from the time I was a little kid. I grew up in St. Louis, and we used to go to the Jefferson Memorial, which is a great museum, and they had a big statue of him. Yes. And then when I started being more interested in women's history, and I started finding out about his ideas about women and how women shouldn't go into politics and shouldn't have jobs and should just please their husbands and their fathers, I was kind of mad at him. The deeper I got into this, the more I saw that he was, like many of us, doing the best he could in a bad situation, in a hedge situation. He was trying to fulfill his vision of himself as men of the time envisioned themselves.
Why do you care about Jefferson today, and what ramifications does that have as we move forward, especially with the political climate we're in right now?
Well, I think that people's private lives do matter, but not necessarily because we should censure them if they ever fall down, right? If they ever do something wrong. I don't really have a problem with Thomas Jefferson having a complicated family. And I think, for many years, historians, and particularly white male historians, defended the idea that Thomas Jefferson was this, kind of pillar of righteousness that would never do anything wrong. Oh, yes, well, he had slaves, but he really hated slavery. Or, well, he had a passionate relationship with his wife and, loved dogs or whatever. Right. But Jefferson had a complicated interracial family. He had a shadow family. He lived in a house divided. And we all have really complicated families.
Right. Here we're saying Jefferson had this interracial, marriage and complicated family. Shouldn't that be okay?
I would say that the interracial family that he had was for a long time cast as a weakness or a sin. Or something that was unmentionable. And I see it simply as something that is complicated and, as a historian, fascinating. And I also think, if we give up this picture of Jefferson as a marble statue, as a perfect man, as the founding father with the capital Fs, that we gain something more, So what? Yeah. If he has the complicated family, We all have that, and what we get is a founding father who's not just for perfect people, but a founding father for all of us.
Virginia, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Joining me is Dr. Eva Chi, Assistant Professor of Chemical Engineering at the University of New Mexico, doing research in the area of protein dynamics. And more specifically, I guess one of those topics, Dr. Chi, is Alzheimer's. What is preventing us from finding a cure?
We don't yet have a good understanding of what causes the changes that we see in Alzheimer's disease. The healthy brain is made up of billions of neurons in a really interconnected network. And in an Alzheimer's disease brain, a lot of the neurons have died. And so the connections have been lost. And in its place, what we see are the kind of the dead neurons containing neurofibrillary tangles inside the neurons. And in between the neurons, we see these amyloid plaques. And what happens is that this causes brain degeneration. It disrupts the kind of the neuronal network. So a lot of the brain functions are compromised.
All right, so let's look at a healthy brain, for instance. And what are we seeing here? The neurons are specifically, these are pathways that contribute to the brain's function.
So the brain is made of billions of neurons, and all the neurons are interconnected, and they make trillions of connections.
You talked about plaques and tangles, and those are some of the things that you see in the diseased brain.
Exactly.
And that's a much different, a big contrast compared to the healthy brain. Talk a little bit about that.
So in place of healthy neurons, in Alzheimer's disease, there's a lot of neurodegeneration, meaning that a lot of these neurons have died. And the brain as a whole literally shrinks in size if you compare Alzheimer's brain to that of a healthy brain. In place of that, there are two prominent hallmarks that we see, which are these neurofibrillary tangles inside dying or dead neurons, and also plaques, these massive proteins, amyloid plaques, that are in between the neurons.
What makes the good plaques go bad? Do we know that?
So what we know is that these plaques are composed of protein aggregates. That is, these proteins have come together to form in a particular morphology, particular form, in that they come together to form these fibrils. And that we know that both the plaques and tangles are composed of these tangles. What we don't know is what caused these proteins to undergo this transformation of forming these fibrils. So there are two questions that we still don't have the answers for. One is why do these proteins, in the population who does get Alzheimer's disease, undergo this process to form these fibrils, and also during the process, what causes the neurons to die? Why do these proteins start to lose their, kind of their good structure to form this structure that are found in disease brains? And what's the process of forming that? So what triggers it, and how does the process actually come about?
Do we know how we prevent them from losing their structure or their health?
We know what keeps a protein happy.
What's that?
In that
What keeps it happy and looking like that first slide we saw?
Right. So proteins, their functions depend on their structure. But these structures are very delicate. So you could think of kind of the protein structure as a house of cards. So if any disturbance happens to any part of the protein, then the whole structure can fall apart. So it is that delicate. And actually our body spends a lot of energy to keep, for example, our body temperature at 37 degrees, keep the pH and water content inside and outside the cells exactly the same. We spend, like I said, a lot of energy maintaining that. So we know that under those conditions, proteins are happy. Once they destabilize, they can become very sticky towards each other, that they start to form these aggregates. If you think about, again, the analogy of house of cards, once one piece is removed or even bumped a little bit, then the whole structure falls apart. So what we're trying to do is kind of find that trigger. So the scale that we're doing our investigation on is really on the protein level, which are between 1 to 10 nanometers in size. A nanometer is 1 times 10 to the negative 9 meters. And to change that scale to the scale of a brain, that's 12 orders of magnitude, so one with 12 zeros in terms of size. So we're going from how an individual molecule acts, which is at the heart of the problem, to how that interaction affects how the brain works, which is really what Alzheimer's disease is about. So the problem of studying proteins at the molecular level to kind of predicting the behavior of the brain, which, as we know, is about this big, we're dealing with a vast range of scale of sizes, and that's a complicated problem. What we're studying applies to not just Alzheimer's disease, but this class of amyloid diseases in general,
Which includes Parkinson's and a host of other diseases.
And Huntington's disease, for example.
Okay.
So what we believe is that there are some commonalities with these proteins, in that they are, I guess, promiscuous in their interactions, that they have a higher tendency or propensity to interact with other structures in the cell. So what we're trying to explore is really kind of their abnormal interaction with the cell membrane that maybe can trigger the protein to what we call misfold, meaning that they go into a structure that's not a native structure.
Do they break the membrane of that cell they're in? And
That's a really good question.
Okay.
So the second line of investigation that we're trying to look at is to answer the question of toxicity. Why do these become toxic, or how do these proteins exert toxicity during aggregation? So what we're trying to do is looking at interaction between these proteins with the lipid membrane, and how that interaction affects the structure of the protein, and also how those interactions affect the integrity of the membrane.
what have we learned from this kind of research this far?
So what we've learned is that in the presence of certain lipid membranes, membranes made of certain lipids, they form the fibers much more quickly and at much lower concentrations. And the second thing that we found with their interaction with the membrane is that once these proteins start to aggregate, they interact more strongly with the membrane, and they can actually destroy the integrity of the membrane, essentially making the cell membrane that encloses the cell leaky. And once that happens, the cell can die. So your question about what can we do about it, what we envision is if the interaction between these proteins and the cell membrane can trigger or seed structural changes in the protein such that they undergo aggregation to form these fibrils, then if we block that interaction between the protein and the membrane, we can potentially prevent these fibers from forming. Yeah.
Thank you.
When I think about the robot, I really don't think about that, robotic unit with moving awkwardly, That's why I prefer to call what we work with unmanned autonomous systems. So the fundamental question is that how should I design the decision-making process of each individual robot? First key feature they need to have is sensing, so that they can collect whatever information they need from the environment. They have to navigate, so they have to be able to avoid obstacles and bumping into things. They need to be able to build a perception of what's going on in the environment so that they can then plan their movement. And so the next important factor is the communication. So this is important because each node relies on exchanging the information, so it really helps it build a better understanding of the environment. Then it needs to constantly make and update its understanding of what's going on, and then make a decision of, let's say, where to go next and so on. I was interested in to see if we could actually go one step further and have them be able to actually see through walls or anything that is right in front of them. I come from a wireless communication background. I thought, well, why not we use the wireless signal, the transmission between two robots, and try to extract the information about the obstacles that signal visited as it was traveling in between them. The thing is that the wireless transmission carries information because each obstacle attenuates the signal to some extent. So the information of those obstacles, those visited obstacles, are embedded in the signal in some sense. And so we were able to actually show that actually you could extract the information, and we have some preliminary results, and we're working on extending it to more complicated scenarios as well. Because it becomes so challenging, we feel that we need multidisciplinary approaches, that you cannot just focus on the communication issues only, or on navigation issues, or on sensing issues. You need to look at all of them together. And that can result in more out-of-box thinking, and that's really important in these systems. Do that because that's really something specific we do. It really not been done before. So the specific applications, well, I think the most important ones are things like emergency response and search and rescue. Things that involve going to places that are dangerous for human, like Japan, the tsunami, things like that. There are going to be also other applications that we can't even imagine about now, of having them be part of our society, really. And as we're putting the whole picture together, the possibilities would be really unimaginable.
Thank you for watching. Do you have a question for our experts? Please email us your viewer questions and comments to askconnect@knme.org. Production support provided by the University of New Mexico.